Hello, members of our esteemed Stygian family. Holly Rhiannon here. I wanted to stop in to briefly provide an introduction for this interview and interviews moving forward. Recently, we have brought on a new community manager by the name of Olivia Van Gwyn. We made contact when they reached out regarding the Stygian Zine, and we immediately saw their immense talent and included them in the inaugural issue. When we put out the word that we needed a community manager to help out with Stygian and grow with us, Olivia was quick to make contact, and we were quick to accept them into the societal fold. Olivia is a talented author who has recently signed on with At Bay Press for their debut novel slated for 2025, and I'm so pleased to introduce them as our new community manager. Now, enjoy this interview with Giller Prize shortlister André Narbonne, who was also featured in our first issue of the Stygian Zine.
Hello to everyone out there on YouTube. Very excited to be here today. We are restarting the interview series for Stygian Society. This time we are interviewing contributors to the Stygian Zine, which I'm very excited about. We are going to be doing one interview per month, all the way up until the release of issue 2. And we have a lot of very exciting conversations planned for that. So I'm very excited about that. Just stay tuned on our YouTube channel. For this one, for the first interview we have for our zine contributors, I'm sitting here with André, who I'm very excited to talk to. Andre, would you like to just start us off, if anyone doesn't know, with just a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me. Um, I'm André Narbonne. I'm the author of 3 books. The last one was my first novel that was nominated for the Giller Prize. That's about the height of my success to this point. I live in Windsor, Ontario, where I teach at the University of Windsor. And yeah, I've always been a writer. And I think that my interest in the sort of things that Stygian Society publishes comes from the fact that as a child, I used to go on very long bus rides, Thunder Bay to Toronto, really long rides, and I would always read Hitchcock magazine, things like that. And a lot of my writing involves the sort of things that Edgar Allan Poe would be interested in.
For sure. Sounds great. And if anyone doesn't know, the Giller Prize is the most prestigious literary prize in Canada. So that's a huge, huge deal. And I'm excited to talk about that. Um, so before we jump into our conversation, I was hoping that we could start off with a quick reading from you, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to read from the first third of the story that's in the most recent publication, Stygian Society. And it's a story about somebody who's coming to terms with death, and he calls it a monster. This part involves his childhood and his mother. The first day of kindergarten, my mother learned I'd died. Even though it wasn't true, it affected her profoundly. The secretary rang the house. A deep pulse in her voice choked the words. My mother, a large woman, not given to exercise, ran down a road she and I first walked when my walk was a toddle, panted past the corner where, 2 weeks before my birth, a transport struck down my father and sister. She made the hospital, discovered the mistake, a clerical error at a school still learning my name, and collapsed in a heap, hitting her head on the reception counter. Thus began my mother's journey. A day later, on the way back home, She discovered that all the places she knew with the intimacy of grief had learned to speak. The plum tree in the front yard, ripe with yellow, a tree that I tried to climb yearly until I grew old enough to triumph, spoke in leafy tones about the ladder my mother fetched to retrieve me because I could only ascend. The leaves did not genuflect to meaning. They knew the story as a vivid expectation, an undirected urgency. At odd times in the years that followed, the stories came unbidden. The dewy lawn knew things she had forgotten in her pain, new shoes that pinched, old shoes open at the toe to the rain and snow. The words sprang fecund. The garden, denuded of snapdragons by my 2-year-old fingers, was the same garden my sister had run through on a muddy morning 3 springs before, as shoots were showing. In a flowery voice that stopped my mother, it told both stories, left her perplexed in a pouring rain, staring into the deeply finite.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And for anyone who hasn't read the zine, that was Monsters on the Lawn. It's this really, really wonderful story from issue 1. It's this, I would describe it as this very dense storm cloud of remembrances and observations. Um, what you were talking about before, these ideas of death and of grief and of familial grief. And the nucleus of the story is revolving around this psychological monster who one day utters, "You must fall in love." And that's where everything kicks off. It spirals out from there. Um, and I was wondering if, when you were writing the story, if you started in the same way, if you started with that line and then wrote outwards, or if it kind of um, consecrated in the middle with that line there.
I'm not sure. I can describe my process, which as a general rule is I know what I'm going to write before I write it. I tend to be something of an architect. I know what the argument is, and then the characters sort of adhere to that, and then the plot works with that. Now this one, uh, I wanted the idea was I wanted to write about death in a way that wasn't just a plot device and wasn't some fantastic character, even though I call it a monster. I wanted to talk about how we relate to death and how in relating to death, sort of that identifies us, things about us. So the story is very comical, and the last line suddenly brings it out of that because we do tend to approach things that we can't grasp, things that are too large, with humor, and sort of deflect it in a way. So I think I definitely had that line early because I needed to put something, some shape to it that would organize it. And I wanted him to have this idea of a monster inside of him, some voice inside of him that says something. And he thinks that he's trying to make meaning out of life. And in the end, he realizes he's trying to make meaning out of death.
Mhm. Very cool. And you were talking about how you're a plotter, and you know the story before you write it down. So is there anything that comes out only on the page, or is everything fully formed in your
Oh,
head before you
yeah,
start?
no, I know that's often the complaint against plotters like me, architects. Let's say that that our blueprint is deterministic. It's actually not. It's more of a guideline. And I live happily. I live near the river. I'm in Windsor, Ontario, and I dog out my stories or I'll ride my bike, and I think them out. And I don't start writing till I've walked around with the characters. So I have that. I have their conversations. I have what they look like, what they're doing in my head. But the creative process does happen at the computer. It's just that I never go to the computer unless I know what I want to write. I never sit in front of a blank screen and wait.
So in this story, the protagonist's mother has these really profound, really traumatizing experiences with death. Um, and I really love how there's this lineage of trauma, how the father's death inflicts pain on the mother, and that pain is inflicted on the protagonist. Um, so I was wondering if you could talk about this motif of these indirect experiences, and your choice to convey that moment through the mother as opposed to direct narration.
Yeah, well, I think the character is best created through action. So
Mm-hmm.
I have these moments where people are acting and they don't know what my plot is, so that they're living their own lives. But my plot is the thing that puts them all together and gives a unifying coherence to the story. The mother is somebody who has suffered a profound grief and has waited, as he says, for her own monster. She's allowed herself just to be static, and he
Mm-hmm.
sees her almost like a statue to modernity, to depression. Um, but that's not the whole story. She's somebody who has loves her son. She's traumatized by the fact that she knows that her husband rather, and her daughter were killed because her husband was drunk, and she's going to respond to her son in very uh, familiar and sometimes angry and pointedly angry ways, as people do. When you're very close to someone, sometimes they can hurt you. Well, they hurt you more easily than strangers would. And
Mm-hmm.
she knows what to do. She knows, but he's hurt her a lot. They're
Mm-hmm.
living real lives. I mean, I hope they are, anyways. Even while there's these fantastic elements happening, like she's listening to praying mantis on the side of the house. But even still, I want her to be as real as possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is very real. It's very real how interconnected these characters are, and how their relationships are very textured and very real. So thank you for that. It's a great story. Um, Now I wanted to talk about um, the Giller Prize. I wanted to ask if being longlisted for the Giller Prize, if that's very validating. Like if you had any apprehensions about your writing before, does that kind of make them go away?
Yeah. Well, it was all I ever wanted was to write. I found recently a trunk with things in it that I'd had when I was much younger. I'm much older now. Um, and when I was 16, I lived up in northern Ontario in a mining town on an island, like way up north of Kenora. And I had two subscriptions. I found out when I found this chest. One was to Time magazine, and the other one was to Writer's Digest. When I was 16, living in a mining town, and all this stuff was sent to me. So I mean, most people don't get Writer's Digest until late 20s or at some point when they feel that they have a need for it. I hadn't published anything. I just really was super interested in writing, and that was all that I wanted to do. So what the Giller gives me is, well, people, readers liked what I wrote, and I always wanted to be read. I thought I wouldn't consider myself a writer until I was read by strangers, and the Giller said that happened.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I kind of feel the same way about writing. Is That's a good way to put it. Is when you're read by strangers, you know that there's a kind of validation that you're getting that's only through your writing.
Right.
Um, so I wanted to ask also about what kind of things you draw inspiration on,
Okay.
because you were talking about um, a lot of your personal experiences that you draw from, and then also, I wanted to ask when you feel that your writing kind of stalls, what do you think contributes to that?
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, I can talk about this one in particular, where the inspiration came from, because none of the events actually happened. Although there's one point where, as a child, the protagonist talks to an elderly man and asks him what happens when we die, and he says, "I my first career is as an engineer, so I'm talking just strictly talking engineering." He replies to him that we're energy, and you can't destroy energy; you can only convert it into other forms. And so the kid takes that as something good and says, well, will I get to see my sister and my father? And he says, no. He says, it's like you, death is like going to sleep, but never dreaming. And he realizes the horror of that, like just the complete loss of ego, which is what we hold on to. So clearly, none of this has happened to me. Although, as an engineer, I know you can't destroy energy; you can only convert it into other forms. But I thought of this story when I was in the hospital. 2 years ago, I went in for surgery, and it turned out to be quite bad, and it was long. And I started thinking about it differently. And I thought, well, I'm thinking about things differently than I did before. Can I write about this, and can it be interesting? Because it's something I want to work out. And I think that the writing, uh, by and large, is always philosophically true. Whatever it's taking from. My novel is about a sailor who falls in love with a philosophy major, and he's an engineer. And I'm basically talking from my experience as an engineer when I describe ships, when I describe ports, when I describe how long distance relationships work at sea in an age before cell phones. So all that comes in. Now, when I can't write, uh, it's when I can write, I can hear it. And it's going to sound a little bit silly. It can sound maybe a little bit crackpot, but I can hear metaphors. I'm walking down the street and I'm inventing metaphors, and I like them. I think, okay, well, this is good. I'm in the right place to think about things, and to think about them with the energy that it requires. And I think it comes down mostly to that, because I don't quite believe in inspiration. I believe in energy. Think about things, and you finish them. You finish the idea. So I know when I can do that. And when I can't, read. I consider myself a writer when I'm reading.
Mhm. Great, thank you. Um, and are there any writers or any books that you can point to that have a large footprint on your writing?
Uh, Moby Dick, absolutely. Um, I'm a fan of Conrad. I know those are sailors. It's not just sailors. John Gardner is had a profound effect on me. Gunter Grass, who wrote The Tin Drum, among other things. Um, Alice Munro, I admire, and I'm ashamed I can't write that well. Uh, I mean, there are a lot of writers who are, and I have friends who are writers, and not to diminish them as well. The conversation is important to me. I usually generally have subscriptions to a lot of journals at one time, and what's happened is I've been inspired by people whose names I don't know. I'll be reading a
Mhm.
journal, and I have in the past actually emailed somebody after reading a story in a journal, something like Fiddlehead or someplace, and found the person's email and emailed them and said, "I just read your story. It's fantastic."
That's great. Um, while we're on the topic, are there any literary journals that you can recommend? I feel like we don't talk about the Canadian literary journals enough.
Well, this is what really interested me in what you're doing, because we're coming into dark days. It's hard,
Mhm.
especially like with a print journal, just the very cost of sending it, of mailing it, is prohibitive. I mean, it has to be a work of love, and it has to be a work of idealism, some sort of idealism. So I would say that all journals are good. just depends on what you want. My reading tends to be traditional when it comes to journals, generally. Although I'm a bit of a barracuda. If it's shiny, I go for it. Like I'll read anything. But Fiddlehead, Queen's Quarterly, I enjoy. Dalhousie Review, just those ones. And I am myself the one of the editors of the Windsor Review, which has been around since '65. It's a very old journal.
Oh,
So
wow. No, I didn't know that. I think that literary journals are so important because when you're starting out as a writer, that's how you get your first um, resume lines is by submitting to these journals and getting your name out there. And they're also just so great for staying up to date and for staying in the loop with who's writing, who's putting work out there, who's emerging, and who's established. Really, really great. It's such a bucket list item of mine to get published in the Malahat
yeah, right.
review. Um, so
Maybe. Well, can I say this? One thing with the journals is it's the place where you meet your audience.
yeah,
You first realize I am writing for a specific audience, and it's not simply about me. If I'm not entertaining to them, then they're not going to read me.
yeah, and I think that a really great thing about the journals is that the readers and the subscribers to these journals are, I think, a lot more often than not other writers.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's really special. That I forget who said it. Someone out there said, "Everyone reads novels, but only writers read short stories." Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's really interesting too. That you're sharing with other creative, other like-minded kind of analytical people. Um,
You might say that about chapbooks too. Like
yeah,
chapbooks are ways that poets communicate with each other.
definitely.
Generally, I mean, they could have prose in them too. That's a conversation between poets specifically. But I did read. Like I was saying, like I read. I would read journals with like to read the short stories when I was like 11 years old. I loved short stories. I don't know why. I don't think that I'm exactly like everyone else in this.
And that's okay. We're all weirdos here. Um, so I wanted to ask you. You talked about being an educator. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little about what you were doing with your students recently, what you were teaching.
Well, I am in fact taking a class this year on Moby Dick, and the class just goes through that. And I happen to love that book, and I'm trying to make it lovable to my students. Um, I'm teaching a creative writing seminar, and I'm teaching, uh, co-teaching at the University of Windsor. We have it's called a practicum, where students publish a book. They actually publish it, and it gets put on for sale. And that's just such a great class. They get to read and edit writers, and then put together a book that will get sold in bookstores.
That's really great.
My love, though, is teaching students when they first come in. The introductory English class, I feel, is a place where I can do the most good.
So I was wondering then, both in the creative writing classes and in the critical classes,
Mhm.
um, is there anything that you perceive to be a a really big marker of success for students? And is there anything that you really commonly holds students back?
Well, I'm not going to say anything bad about students. Uh, while I talk about things that hold them back, uh, probably probably the biggest problem people face in university is moving from high school into a world where they have to read on their own. The truth of the university education is that most of it takes place at home. It takes place when students are reading, when they're thinking about the work. I'm trying to teach independent thought. I don't actually try and teach them to think a specific way. I rather want them to learn how to read science and come up with their own ideas. And the very successful students are all creative. Like they're intellectual, but they're creative and they're curious.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I mean, I'm pretty fresh out of university. I've been graduated for um, a little over a year now,
Mhm.
I think. But I do remember um, how nerve wracking those introductory courses were for me. Um, and it is a really, I think, kind of a tense space where you're figuring out if this is something that you want to be doing or not.
Right.
Like whether, if it's creative writing, if creative writing is right for you. Um, so it's such a space of figuring out who you are and what you want to do.
Well, for a lot of students, the big change happens the summer in between first year and second. Because in first year,
Yeah,
they're doing things that they haven't heard before and they're formulating things differently. Then in the summer, they go hang out with their friends who weren't at school with them or were doing other things. And they're watching a movie and they're seeing it differently. And they're actually saying, oh, yeah, no, my friends see it this way, but I can see this instead. And it changes things. It makes them, I think that when students come back in second year, they're ready. And first year, it's hard. It's a hard uh, hill to climb.
definitely. Um, and if I may ask, I wanted to ask, um, not in, I wanted to ask what about Moby Dick appeals to you, such that it's something that you are passionate about sharing with other people.
There's nothing like it in 19th century literature. And it's Melville's sixth book. It's the one that cost him his career, and he decided to do it. It moves in and out of genre. It's really a novel of ideas. It's not an action novel. I mean, people who think of it as Ahab stabbing at a whale have missed about 300 pages of a 340-page book. I mean, there's a chapter on the color white, and it's a long chapter. uh, it's beautifully written. It's humorous, and it's so compelling to get into Melville's mind while he's thinking about this. At the height of his powers, he'll still write good things afterwards, but he's going to be pilloried by the press, especially the Presbyterian press, because he he says it's the third chapter, better to sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunk Christian. And it just goes from there. Right? His relationship with Queequeg were one where he's willing to view the other person as maybe even better than himself and willing to understand his gods. Think, well, if I like the person, I must accept the gods. Well, that couldn't work with an 1850 American press, but he did it. And I like the courage of the novel, and it always surprises me. I don't think it's a novel you should read quickly. I think it's a novel you have to read in bits, and this is why I keep telling my students, because we've got it all parceled out. Is that don't read all the reading for the week in the night before. Just take a bit, and as soon as you find yourself rereading a paragraph, stop, come back to it later. Enjoy it,
Mm.
because it can be enjoyed if it's not a task reading it.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. With these really big, long novels, people just want to blow through them, I
Yeah.
think, so that they can say that they've read it. Um, but for me, a really formative reading experience for me was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. And I had never been so immersed in the world of a novel before that every day for a couple of months I sat down and I relaxed and I created an atmosphere for myself and I just read one or two chapters of it and I treated it like like a TV show where I was watching one episode a day just to dry it out as long as I could.
Yeah, or an elaborate meal where you have a bit at a time, maybe.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that because one thing I really love about a great novel or a great reading, even a short story, is the mood. And that's the thing
Mhm.
that I'll carry with me for a couple of days is the mood of the novel will infect me and I'll have it. I'm happy to have it.
Mhm. Okay, awesome. We are just coming up on the end of our time here. I just wanted to ask you if there was anything that you wanted to talk about that you're working on right now and you would like people to know, or if there's just anything that you would like to tell our audience.
Well, right now I am shopping a book. I've written a long novel. My writing takes a long time, even though I'm an architect. It takes a long time. Well, the novel that I have now, I spent 20 years on, and it's done. It's done. My last novel took 5 years, but this one, and it starts in South Africa in the 19th century and finishes in Winnipeg with the Great Flood in 1950. And it takes on all these world events, and it's really kind of like my previous novel. It's really about love.
Mhm. Great, great. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
sitting here and chatting with me. Um, and for everyone out there, thank you for watching. Um, we look forward to doing some more interviews in the coming months. We will keep you updated on our social media platforms. So follow us along for that on Instagram, on Threads, on TikTok. Um, and I will talk to you guys soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.